Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second reading in our 2021-2022 season of the Milwaukie Poetry Series. I'm Tom Hogan. Welcome, the coordinator of the Milwaukie Poetry Series, and I want to welcome you here tonight. It's very exciting for us to be here. I'm actually here with my lovely wife, Jane, to my right at the Willamette Falls Media Center. Our poet, Judith Barrington, is reading from home tonight. So I had an opportunity just a little bit ago when I came in to say, hello, Judith. I'm looking at her now. So we're going to hear from her in just a minute. I wish we could be meeting in person. It's too bad that we can't. But as we all know, during this pandemic, we're not able to meet as we would like. So we are able to, though, to do virtual readings as we're doing tonight. So thank you very much for all of you who are here. Thank you for all those who are registered. I hope that you are well and safe. A couple of things I want to say before I introduce Judith. One is that our poster for the Milwaukie Poetry Series is here. And I have some copies here in the studio. They came out with the invitation for Judith's reading. So if you saw that invitation, that was an attachment. But if you don't have one, or you would like one, or you would like another one, or you have someplace that you feel that you could put it up, I'd be delighted to have you do that, and I'd be very happy to send you some. So you can send me an email or call me at my number or put something in the chat, and that would be just fine for us to get the poster to you. This is our 15th season, and we're pretty excited about it. I want to say another thing about another event that's coming up. We do sponsor open mics. And so we have our fall open mic on Wednesday, November 3rd, coming up on Zoom at 6:30. So there will be an invitation out for that. And it's registration with me as usual. The theme of the open mic is going to be holidays. We're getting into the holiday season. So that's going to be the theme of the open mic. I want to make some thanks. Firstly, tonight, a big thanks to Joshua Reynolds at the Willamette Falls Media Center for making all this happen and setting it all up so we are actually able to come to you this way. Secondly, thanks to the city of Milwaukie. They have been very supportive of us really from the beginning, and we're in our 15th season. Thirdly, thanks to the Ledding Library of Milwaukie. We are a committee of the Ledding Library, and it's a great library. We have a new library, as you know, in the last couple of years. And so we're very grateful to the support from the Ledding Library. And finally, from the committee, the Milwaukie Poetry Series committee. You know, we have a committee, the committee is active, and it's not something that you have happen with events like this unless you have a group of people working on it. So again, thanks to you all for being here. Now, I want to introduce our poet this evening. I'm very excited to do this. I want you to know that Judith was our third reader when we just started. This was in January of 2008. We started in November of 2007, and she was our third poet. So thank you for that, and we're delighted to welcome her back. She's got an extensive bio. I'd like to share some things with you. Her sixth collection of poetry, Long Love, New and Selected Poems, 1985, 2017, came out in 2018 from Salmon Poetry. She is the author of The Conversation, 2015, whose title poem was the winner of the Gregory O'Donoghue International Poetry Award, and three previous collections of poems, as well as two chapbooks. Her Life Saving, a memoir, was the winner of the Lambda Book Award and runner-up for the Penn Martha Albrand Award for the art of the memoir. Among her other awards are the Robin Becker Chapbook Prize, the Andres Berger Award, the Dulwich Festival International Poetry Competition, an American Civil Liberties Union Freedom of Expression Award, and for the literary arts, the Stuart Hallbrook Award for outstanding contributions with Ruth Gundel to Oregon's literary life. very deserving. She co-founded the Flight of the Mind writing workshops. For 17 years, brought together outstanding teachers and women writers from all over the U.S., a residential summer event in Oregon. She is also one of the founders of Soapstone Incorporated, a nonprofit organization working to support women writers. Judith was for several years on the faculty of the low residency MFA program in creative writing at the University of Alaska Anchorage. She has taught at numerous universities and writing work in the US and has led classes for the Poetry School in London and Almaserra in Spain. She was born in Brighton, England. She lived in Spain for 3 years, and she now has lived in Oregon for 45, where she is an activist for the disabled. That's certainly a lot. And thank you for all the contributions that you've made to the literary life in Oregon. There will be a question and answer period afterwards. I want to say that. And so as we go along, if there are questions that you have of Judith, put them in the chat, and we will be picking up Q&As, and I'll try to take some off the chat when we get to that. So without further ado, would you join me in welcoming our poet this evening, Judith Barrington?
Oh, thank you so much, Tom. I'm overwhelmed. I just want to thank you, and particularly you, and also your board and the volunteers of the Milwaukie Poetry Series who make all of this possible. It's a marvelous series. You have created something quite wonderful, and it's wonderful for the audiences. You've cultivated an audience that's very faithful to the readings, and I know comes to the readings prepared to ask questions and to be entertained by many different poets. And I think for us poets, it's also a gift to be given a space of time in which we can share a selection of our poetry that will get across to such a great audience. I'm very happy to be here. I come to this reading as our illustrious Supreme Court is setting out to do its very worst in a new term with an alarming agenda. I'm sorry to start with this, but it's very important to me. Thanks to he who shall remain nameless, that court now has 6 conservative justices, which is a scary majority. You may have noticed that some of them are lately going public in their own defense, claiming to the world at large that their politics have nothing to do with their judicial rulings. One of the latest of these to go in her own defense was Amy Coney Barrett, who on September the 13th gave a speech in which she said, "The Supreme Court is not a bunch of partisan hacks." Not a bunch of partisan hacks. This was after she voted for the Texas law barring abortions. Well, all I can do in response to that woman is to quote Hamlet. Hamlet often has a useful response to things, and in this case, it comes right from Queen Gertrude. "The lady doth protest too much, methinks." The lady doth protest too much. And if you'll allow me one more moment with those Supreme Court sleazebags, I'll remind you that the first right-wing ideologue to be appointed in this latest round of stacking the court was in July 2018, Brett Kavanaugh, whose confirmation was opposed by an incredibly brave woman who came forward to reveal that he had raped her in 1982. I say this was revealed, not alleged, because I believe her. That woman was Christine Blasey Ford, a name that was on our lips and in our minds at the time, but which faded all too quickly. She was ignored, shut up, generally gaslighted. Just as women have been silenced over the centuries, And the methods of shutting up women are what I want to talk about here, or what I want to read a poem about. The methods have changed slightly, but the effects are remarkably similar. This poem that I'm going to read you speaks of how that silencing was done 4 centuries ago. I dedicate the reading of it to Christine Blasey Ford. The poem is called Martha, 1630. Banks, a device consisting of a metal frame for the head and a bit to restrain the tongue, formerly used to punish scolds. 1. It was nothing but the truth, what I said. He was lazy. He smelled like a pig. He hit me for no cause, but that I spoke. Anyway, 'twas for his own good. I said what I said, hoping he'd go to work or wash himself at the pump before he ate. So what if I said it more than once? He didn't hear it the first time, nor the third, as far as I could tell. He never looked up. So then I spoke louder, like you do to one who is deaf or a little simple. Yes, I cursed him. Just once I cursed his name. Raise your voice, do you? He said. So I turned my back and busied myself at the stove, stirring the porridge oats. I made it just the way he likes it, but he was gone when I served it up with a knob of butter I begged from the farm. Before I could eat even a spoonful myself, they came in, 3 of them, smiling, casual-like. One of them held the thing. I knew what it was. 2. A boy once told me my cheek were pink like fruit, but now 'tis raw where the bridle grips, and pus is crusted under the metal rods. Was pride another sin? My hair, once blonde, hasn't been washed. I've let it go to grease. The headpiece rests on that join atop my skull, where bone meets bone. It must have been soft when my newborn skull rested in mother's palm. She warned me, my man, told me to watch my tongue, and now my tongue's held down by the bit. She was right. I always did speak my mind too much. The sores on my lips make me think on that boy. So many years since I learned to kiss. So many years since I wanted to kiss. Now, when I make his porridge, I hawk and spit. I've lately been reading a new book by Carolyn Forche. It's a wonderful book. It's called In the Lateness of the World. And there's a poem in there called Morning, with some lines that I wrote down in my notebook. And these are the lines. For if the earth is a camp and the sea an ossuary of souls, light your signal fires. An ossuary of souls is an odd expression, an ossuary being a container or depository for the bones of the dead. It's a word quite clearly about bones, about the physical self. And yet, in this instance, there's a bone container that holds souls, souls which in most beliefs and most mythologies are separate from the physical body. And yet, in this instance, the bone container, the ossuary, contains souls, which is strange. The souls in this next poem are underwater. And just because they are down below does not mean they can't be in heaven too. Souls underwater, no longer tumbled by currents, as when, long ago, they were lodgers in frail bodies. Now they drift free of the flesh that was sucked and nibbled from bones, and the blood that swirled away, its quick red streaking the deeps. Souls mingle in the democracy of weed, passing through great barnacled bulkheads, once passengers, transparent without furs or jewels, glide through the shiver that marks the presence of stoker or convict or the drunken oilman who one night staggered to the edge of the spider-legged rig and, dreaming of his girlfriend, unusually tender in his mind at that busy moment, plunged through cans and plastic trash into the arms of another. "Welcome," said the souls, though his ears heard nothing. No longer sailors nor slaves, still they remember the struck bell piercing sleep, the darkness below decks where rats splashed in the bilges, the wide-eyed newborn who flew over the deck rail, saved from the plantation by her mother's arm. Oceans are thick with them, submariners floating free of their vaults, and pilots whose planes dropped from the sky like giant guillemots, but failed to surface with a catch of fish. The careless were snatched by sneaker waves, the joyful by cruising sharks who dispatched them with a lunge and spat out their splintered surfboards. Some are surprised to find themselves here, having thought they'd ascend to the heaven of upper airs or deep star space. But these are the heavens, say the souls, the heavens below. So now that I've taken you underwater, I'm going to stay down there for a minute and pursue my undersea fascination. As Tom knows, I have a chapbook that's all about ocean poems, and I've written a lot about the ocean. So this next poem came to me thanks to John Fowles. He is one of my favorite authors, a novelist, a diarist, author of The French Lieutenant's Woman, which you might remember from a rather good movie that was made from it. He wrote the text also for a collaboration with the wonderful photographer Faye Godwin. And it's a book called Islands, which I found quite by chance in my local library. Local libraries, I like that. They will produce things you don't expect to find. It's a book about the Scilly Isles, islands situated off the western tip of the United Kingdom in a stretch of ocean, sometimes considered the most dangerous of all to shipping. That book contains a photograph of a cargo ship under sail in the days when cargo ships were still sailing ships. And it's a ship that foundered there on the rocks and went down, being watched by people, crowds of people who stood on the cliffs of Cornwall as the ship went down into the dark, deep depths. The people who were watching included some people who were known as wreckers, and those were people who made money from salvaging what was left of wrecks after they were wrecked on rocks or in other places. This poem is called Elegy for Mildred. Mildred struck off Gurnard's Head, Cornwall, at midnight, April the 6th, 1912. Sometimes the wrecks are layered on top of older wrecks in this most deadly 10 square miles of sea. Mildred was Cornish-built, three-masted, hauling slag. Her spars dark in the fog, her canvas slack. When the cry came, breakers ahead, the panicking crew ran through the night, trying to come about, while some climbed high in the rigging, assuming the ship was lost. The captain hollered up and promised safety, a boat they could all escape in, a sea calm in the fog. Indeed, they rowed along the coast and landed safe at St. Ives. On the cliffs in dawn's clear light, the crowds gathered to watch as Mildred, upright still, settled into her bed. Local wreckers muttered, "Her cargo's useless, nothing to gain from the carcass, nor e'en her sails." But lovely they were, those sails, their rigging draped like skirts, and the topmost spars already forming a cross, as if her grave were waiting below, waiting for surf to break her back and part her seams and lick at the joints of the wheel and the gimbal ring of the compass, till dishes and socks and barrels of grog and charts that were useless to steer her home all would slowly let go and spiral down to settle in sand. Pieces of Mildred, barnacled Lagan, lie there still, the last of her elegance underneath mounds of silt, her shipwright's art forever lost to brine and time and waves that beckon and moan, beckon and grieve. I love that ship. It's a wonderful photograph. I wish I could show you the photograph of her settling down as she sinks down below the rocks. So I'm going to leave us now, leave the ocean where I've taken you for a minute, and move on to dry land. I'm going to take this chance to read a longer poem, one of the longer poems in this book. It's a poem called "The Dyke with No Name Thinks About Landscape." It's a poem about the relationship, my relationship, to various landscapes in my life. You may recognize some of them. There are clues. And it's about, in a way, about how that relationship to the land may have been impacted by my being a lesbian. It's also a meditation on the notion of the word natural and its origins in the word nature. This came from when, well, back in 1992, we LGBTQ people, I think we didn't have quite as many letters in our names then, were being attacked in a proposed statewide measure that aimed to label us, quote, unnatural and perverse. And that's what got me thinking about the word unnatural, not related to nature. There's also in this poem a reference to death, which has in mind a 1988 attack on the Appalachian Trail of two lesbians, one of whom died. The other, Claudia Brenner, survived and wrote a book about it. And lastly, I'll just say, the Dyke with No Name is a persona I've used in many poems, and she is, of course, me. This poem is in 6 parts. The Dyke with No Name thinks about landscape. 1. At first, it wasn't landscape at all. Where you live is just where you live. A place to walk about in, drive your car through on the way to somewhere. Notice on a pretty day when clouds are puffs and grass is blowing just so. From a horse's back, tracking the skyline, grey sea became grey sky, and chalky paths down the escarpment gashed the smooth flank of the downs. Leaning over to unhook the chain of a 5-bar gate, she knew just how fast to sidle the horse through before the metal gate swung back with a clang, and the horse twitched an ear, too familiar with the sound to make a fuss. The windmills, Jack and Jill, spread their sails and grew as organic as gorse bushes or hairs on the barren plough. But their spread sails remained unmoved by the great wind which stirred up a great wave in the grasses from Firle to Beachy Head. Up there on her horse, she too grew organic as winter wheat, never naming the villages far below. Poynings, Ditchling, Fulking, Stenning, distant clusters of roofs that revealed to her, as if through a telescope, a particular lich gate, a brick well, a post office serving cream teas. 2. When she left, it became landscape, a beloved green painting hauled around in her mind, while the next one, ochre and sage, unfolded, smelling of Mediterranean pine in the afternoon, and the one after that, sepia and umber, threw open its chest and sang. In these landscapes, too, she wanted to grow organic, spreading her limbs to the sky on that almost flat rock that jutted from the river and held her between two swirling streams. Pinpoints of spray pricked her skin, which dried and dried between the divided waters, while the river, too, turbulence, rocks, moss, trout, and human body, pried open the hot thighs of the desert with the persuasive pressure of wetness. Was it then that it started? Then she began to feel the eyes watching. In each landscape, people grew from the shadows. In each landscape, people belonged. But here on her rock, head in the V of the parted waters, the dyke with no name sees herself as if with eyes watching from the hill above, sees the desert intersected by river, sees ponderous rocks, shaggy falls, the cruising hawk, and herself, a human figure growing from shadows, herself in the frame on the rock, not belonging. 3. The trouble is not nature, she thinks, but the people who tell you there's always one of each, starting with Noah and his couple-filled floating zoo. Pistils and stamens, winged seeds from trees, insects waving their various appendages. She remembers her smudgy drawings from biology. She knows what they left out and why. The trouble with pastoral scenes is the lover, the hand in hand, one of each, lover and his lass. She knows it's more than looking wrong in the picture. But does she know it's a matter of life and death? 4. Whose life? Whose death? All she wanted was to move again like the winter wheat, to live in her skin, touching the earth's skin, to feel spray and rock on the finger of the sun. Once, a long time ago, she made love on a hilltop under copper beech trees. Leaves turned to mulch underneath her as she breathed the sky through her lover's hair. And somewhere close by, a pony snickered, a friendly snicker, an acknowledgement. She still remembers what it felt like to lie in those arms, some of them beech roots, others human and female, trusting the pony like a brother, the sky looking down the same way she looked up. That was before the 2 hikers were shot, the 2 women stalked for days by the man who killed one and left the other for dead, one each for life and death, as it turned out. 5. There is nothing organic about cars. They skim across surfaces separated from the landscape by hard black tarmac, no danger of putting down roots. Even when a car disintegrates into the ground, blackberries filling the bent frame of its windshield, rusty chassis sinking into the earth to blue up some passing hydrangea. Even then, its chrome and oil and plastic seats spurn the comfort of ordinary rot. The dyke with no name kept moving, her rubber tires grabbing the blacktop with a squeal as she pushed sideways through bends, kept everything skidding. Tall haystacks with poles poking out the top dashed by her window. She noted their shape, their resemblance to some señorita's hair held up by a protruding pin. She watched the show through glass as if she had put in her penny on the pier, watched herself from the hillside above, speeding through picture after picture, silk headscarf flying, arm on the door, tanned, hands turning the small leather wheel. Sometimes when her head raged with pain, she parked the car in a field and slept, all doors locked, all windows up, while the grasses tickled the hot skin of her tires. 6. Now she is lying on a blanket, the sand below molded to the shape of her body. Sudden swells slap the shore beyond her feet. A barge has passed by, trudging downriver with its load like a good-natured shire horse, its throbbing lust behind the breaking of that great wave, which seems to rise from the deeps. The turbulence is quick, a lashing of the sand, followed by September's lazy calm, as the river moves unseen again, cows from another world low on the far shore, and the seagull's body, a fragile handful, dangles gently between its two tremendous wings. The trouble is not nature, she thinks, but the people who say, I'm not part of it. They're trying to paint me out of the landscape, says the dyke with no name. But her thighs in hot sand remember a horse's warm back as the wind makes a great wave from Oregon to Beachy Head. So in this next poem, I'm going to give you some thoughts that I once had about changing landscapes in the middle of my life. Well, at the time, it was the middle of my life, but then it's no longer. When I look back, it's very early in my life that happened. Anyway, it's called Countries, and I moved from one landscape to a new landscape, and that new landscape is the one that I live in now, on which I adopted for my own long ago. The poem also begins with the London Underground, leaving London. And if you've ever ridden the London Underground, you'll remember that the maps for the London Underground are in many colors for the different rail lines. Countries. Changing countries midlife is a bit like changing trains mid-town. You step off the Bakerloo line, that muddy brown path on the map, where suspicious eyes peer over newspapers. Why are you leaving? Where are you going? and board the district and circle, whose green and yellow lines drag memories of springtime across each plan, above each vicious sliding door. Stand clear of the doors, and they hiss with gusto as you stumble towards a new life, hoping they will not squeeze you in their impersonal grip, and the whole train watch as you cry out, stuck with one foot in each world. To change countries midlife is to change meal times, tax forms, the shape of mailboxes, and to discover that green and white chalk hills falling down to the grey sea are etched into your heart. Dutiful at first, you admire forests of Douglas fir, but they roll away on such a grand scale that you long for an unassuming pigsty or a shearing shed between narrow pathways of mud. You miss leaning on gates to discuss the weather with strangers and footpaths from which you glimpse the private lives of back gardens. You miss a particular smell of salt and chalk carried by massive winds from the channel, and the almost white cliffs turning blunt faces towards France, their toupees of bright green turf threatening to lift and sail away. You know how to love those soft valleys, in spite of the miseries you know they hide, where you simply happened to be born. There, your heart knows the difference between a politician and an oak tree. But here, when your heart begins to stir in the arroyos and mesas of O'Keeffe, giant mouth of petal hinting at stamen, sandstone canyon and dwelling, words carved out of rock, sage in the nose and insects rolling their R's. You wonder, can you trust your heart's response? Should you adopt this new landscape, this powerful sky? And is to choose a land also to choose a people?
Mm.
I once wrote in a poem, which I'm going to read to you in a minute, something about oceans, the oceans, many oceans that I knew. And I wrote, take me eyes bound and remove the blindfold. And I recognize the ocean, as if somehow oceans were recognizable, distinct one from another. I'm not so sure now. I think that's probably not a very true idea, but at the time, I believed in it, and I also thought that it made a very good metaphor at the time when we in the women's movement were starting to move away from our early thinking that we were all the same because we were all women, and sisterhood was what kept us together. The ecstasy of discovering sisterhood. But at that time, then, there was a hint of starting to recognize our differences, that we were, in fact, not all the same. And we were, as we've now discovered, very, very different from each other. Naming the waves. We are done with feeling all the same. Done with that blind joy of sudden recognition. Womanness alone will not get us through. Our differences are like the oceans, all bodies of water, yes, but take me eyes bound to any shore, remove the blindfold, and I recognize the sea. Atlantic gray is not Pacific green gray, is not Aegean clear green, though we hardly know the words to describe the differences. There are places, though, where patterns in the water guiding sailors have names in different languages. Take me eyes bound and remove the blindfold. This next poem kind of goes on from that idea of taking you eyes bound. And there's an epigraph to this poem taken from C.D. Wright, the wonderful late poet, from her book Deep Step Come Shining, and a line that I took from her: "So Gloucester had to smell his way to Dover." That, of course, comes from Shakespeare, King Lear, and the character Gloucester in King Lear is blinded during the course of the play, and then I believe has to find his way to Dover. And the poet was just surmising that perhaps he had to smell his way to Dover since he could not see. In this poem, I'm not talking about Dover, but about another place, a place I visited once that stayed with me very strongly. And I wondered, would I be able to recognize that place if I were blindfolded? Could someone else recognize it if I blindfolded them and then helped them on to see, could they tell where they were if I did that? The poem gives a clue. The poem gives a clue, and the title is Henge, Henge. A henge, of course, refers to a prehistoric monument. It's usually made of stone and standing in a circle, hence Stonehenge. But in this poem, it's not Stonehenge, but Avebury, which is another circle made up of these wonderful standing stones, where we believe, some of us believe, that once, very long ago, women conducted ceremonies in special places. This is called Henge. Blinded or blinded, one permanent, other temporary. Either way, you sniff or grope or feel your way. So now, and turn left here. This small gate will swing open. Make sure it latches behind you. Animals must graze. Can you feel how short the grass, how smooth the turf, shorn by the length of ruminants? Yes, they must be sheep. Careful where the path is slick. You cannot see how it's white with chalk, how clouds creep across the turf like shadows from long ago. Stone-cutting men, hauling with iron machinery, heave the sarsens upright. No, nobody knows how. Put out your hands and feel their scarred bodies. Soon you will know where you are. Smell the wind rising from cricket pitch and churchyard. Smoke with a hint of fish and chips. Wind with a hint of horse. White horse carved on the north escarpment, or a live, glossy horse, her flank the pride of her groom, or even the pub sign, horse and groom, creaking as it sways in the wind, glossy paint faded and cracked. Now, do you know? Feel with your feet the stones right and left, marking out the avenue, processional route long before monks with sandaled feet. Clouds become the shades of women making ritual, and the wind wafts sweetness from the manor's lavender walk, or its rose garden paced by the shadow of Queen Anne. Turn your nose up like a hound and swivel your head through time. Now, do you know where you are? I like that mystery of that. It's a mystery to me, too. It's a mysterious poem, and it's a mystery to me. I have just two more poems. One is very short. This one is about another piece of land that I grew to know very, very well, and that's Soapstone. the forested land on which we built, or community there built, a women's writing retreat. This is from a longer poem, and it's called Ghosts of Soapstone. And I must say that I want to dedicate this little poem to Ruth, because I believe, I think it's possible that maybe she loved the dog in this poem more than anybody else in the world. From Ghosts of Soapstone. Between the barn door and the woodshed, an old black dog lies on the paving that holds a hint of warmth in its pink striations. She tilts her grey muzzle up to the sky, knowing in the way dogs know that death, not the word, but the next unknown, waits over there behind the huckleberries, whose fragrance she half scents, half remembers, because she still has a dog's nose. Grey diggers and moles thinks she is an angel. Coyote nods his head towards her light and goes on his way, howling. My dear friend Maxine Cumin possibly invented a genre of poems, a genre that some of us are writing as we grow old. She called them deathy poems, deathy as in death, because they were a lot about death. I don't think it's become a legitimate genre, but I do think it's a nice idea, because we do end up writing these poems as we get older. I'll end with reading one of them in her memory. And I'd just like to say that when you start to listen to a poem that has death in the title, really don't put on that somber face, that kind of face that you feel you ought to put on because it's suitable for listening to a poem about death. I want to say to you that it's really okay to laugh at death. This is called Shopping for Death. We are searching for a spark between the living and the dead, something that might ignite near the carved name, waits for a visitor, one who perhaps has nothing left to say. We are searching for a plot to buy, a plot where the spark might catch when one of us lies down there, bones intact, or maybe just a heap of ash, a flash of recognition when the other appears, holding a flower from our garden or a bowl of raspberries the dead one is too dead to enjoy, eyes too empty to appreciate the scarlet fruit she once picked each morning before breakfast. I imagine myself the buried one. I imagine myself the visitor. Visitor is easier to conjure, though more painful, loss being an ache in the living body, an ache I felt before, whereas being the dead one is unfathomable, nothing at all like sleep. Here is an available plot. A tree looms nearby, neighbors to the south, a close couple, but somehow I don't warm to it, as if house hunting on a street that fails to call out, die here, or lie here, or wait here for someone to visit. We are searching for the spark between the living and the soon-to-be dead, one above, the other below, though we don't know which is which, don't know upright from prone, or what it will be like down there. What if I should ask, can I try it on for size? Thank you. I'm kidding. Thank you. I hope I didn't go too long.
You were just right. Can I try it on for size? Thank you, Judith.
That's what you think when you are walking around a cemetery trying to find a plot that it's impossible. It really reminds me of what it's like when you're looking at houses. You know how they sort of call out to you or they don't.
Well, thank you for such a rich and wonderful reading. It's been wonderful to spend the time here listening to you. I want you to hear, I'd like us to imagine that you're hearing sustained applause.
Oh, thank you. Yes,
sustained applause from those of us who are watching. And that's what we would have if we were all in person. But that's what's happening now with the appreciation for your reading. And just so many things that, and I'll just share a few of them that struck me. Darkness below decks. Methods of shutting up women. Dark, deep depths. Wrecks on top of other wrecks. And you were talking about your fascination with your undersea fascination. I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. Meditations on the word natural. The dike with no name. Grew organic as winter wheat. I loved insects waving their various appendages. There's nothing organic about cars. Changing countries in midlife is like changing trains midline. I have been to London, and ridden the lines there, and know about the lines are different colors, so you kind of get an idea of where you're going. Can you trust your heart? And then you're ending with, it's okay to laugh about death. Can I try it out? Just a couple of things I'll read from the chat. Penelope Schott. Penelope says, thank you, Judith, for being a scold. Andrea Hollander said, so powerful, Judith. Martha, 1630. Yes. I want to start by asking you, who are you reading? You're widely read, but who are you reading now? And
I mentioned Carolyn Forche, and I'm staying with that book for quite a while. She's a poet I have liked for a long time, but her most recent book before this was a memoir, which I read with great interest. I actually was at Hedgebrook at the Writers' Retreat once with her when she was working on that memoir, and I know it took her many years, I think at least 10 years to write it. And I should have probably rushed straight to read that one, but I actually rushed straight to this book of poems because I love her poems so much. And this book is quite marvelous. I'm also reading another love of mine, recently discovered a poetic love of mine, and that's Ada Limon, the poet who has about 5 books out. I just today actually discovered that Powell's on Hawthorne is open for business, and I bought 2 of her books. But I have been interested in her work and have kept notes of a few poems that I've come across in different places. She's been in the New Yorker and other places once in a while. And I know she's a poet who I'm going to live with for a long time. Those are the 2 that I'm mostly reading at the moment, but there are, let's see, I've been reading a lot of fiction because, we've been in lockdown, we've had a pandemic, and so it's sort of been fiction reading time. I read a really marvelous book by a guy called Francis Spufford, a British guy. He wrote a book about New York back in the days, before it was really New York. It was He walked through the city and he ended up in a field, sort of past, I forget what numbered street because I'm not that familiar with New York. But it was a marvelous insight into the times of New York back when. And he's an interesting writer. He's got a new book out that I'm going to read shortly. Also, God, I could talk about, I've read so much fiction in this last year. Perhaps that's enough to keep you going. I won't answer it at length.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Yes.
Speaking of writing, I have a question from Andrea Hollander. And she says, can you say something about what you're writing?
What I'm writing? Oh, well, I'm working on another memoir. I wrote a memoir called Life Living, which was published a long time ago now. And I'm writing another memoir, which is, it's difficult to describe. I would say the serious thread of the subject matter is about the dangers of not grieving when we should be grieving. And that's something that I have experienced in my life. And the other thread, which is less of a serious and heavy-duty one, is dogs. There are many, many, many dogs in this memoir, and it's in a way structured around the dogs of my life. And so I don't know, Penelope, Andrea won't be that pleased to hear that perhaps, but Penelope might be glad to hear that because we share a lot of dogs. And when we had Yofi, he would go to Penelope's salon at her house, and Yofi would lie and listen to the poems and wag his tail very gently. Unfortunately, he died last year, and we miss him awfully. But dogs do figure in this new memoir, and that's the part that's a pleasure to write. The part about grief is less pleasurable.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
There's a question from Judy Montgomery, and she's noting so many poems in second or third person. Was this a natural choice from the beginning, or something you came to, perhaps as a way of achieving distance?
Well, it's hard that you should say that because I wasn't aware. I think it's somewhat a product of with the choices that I made for this reading, because I read that very long poem, The Dyke with No Name Thinks About Landscape, and when I wrote in her persona, I always were writing in third person. And initially, I created her in order to write in the third person. Back in the day when I found it quite uncomfortable to write poems about being a lesbian in the first person. I don't any longer. That's not true anymore. But so that's one long poem that was in third person. And I guess the henge poem, I was talking to the person in the poem who I blindfolded and wanted to get them to guess where they were. And so that's another one in second person. So I guess that is true that there's quite a lot of poems in this reading that are in both second and third person. Not all of them, because obviously Countries is a poem in first person, and Souls Underwater is also in the first person. But I have written in all of those different modes over time, and I think that this was a little bit skewed because of what I chose. Okay.
Well, thank you. I want to plant an idea, and that's if you have one poem that you would like to end on. We'll take a couple more questions. Yeah, we'll take a couple more questions, and then it's nice if there is a poem that you'd like to end on. So.
Oh, okay.
So we could just we can think about that. I'm going to see if my lovely wife Jane has any question that she'd like to ask.
I've wondered how you started writing poetry. Where did the first impulses come?
Well, I was I was lucky. I went to school. I grew up in England, so I went to school. Went to a girls' school in England, where there was a lot to be sorry about that was not taught to me. I got no science whatsoever, but I did get a very good literary education, and part of what I learned was how to write essays. We had to write many essays in very long essays, and also our exams were essay questions. So I got to write a lot. But that wasn't, of course, poetry. The thing was that we did read a lot of poetry, and I wrote it rather naturally at that age, when I was at high school age, and then at the sort of age I was a teenager when I would be hiding it in drawers, as one did as a teenager, because one's mother might find what was written there. But basically, it was something that came relatively easily. And then when I moved to the States, well, actually, before I moved to the States, I was in London. I was in various women's groups in London, and one of them was a women's writers group in which we published our own work and published other people's work as well. So that was where I got that going.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, 2 more questions.
Okay.
Here's one from the chat. Jacqueline de la Harpe asks, "Take me icebound and remove the blindfold." What poetry book is that from? Take me icebound and remove the blindfold.
Well, it's the poem that I read is from Long Love, the poem that it was inspired by. My poem was Henge, and that's the poem about finding your way blindfolded to somewhere. And so that was my poem, Henge. It was also inspired by C.D. Wright's poem, which she wrote about in her book. I forgot which book it was now, but it's a C.D. Wright poem in which she says that Gloucester had to find his way to Dover. He had to smell his way to Dover. And that was what got me thinking about the whole question of if you know a place well enough to actually be able to tell where you are, if you're blindfolded or if you can't.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. I wanted to ask you, last question, about your fascination, your undersea fascination.
Oh,
and you talked about that, and you read a couple of poems that take place off the coast of Cornwall. And when did you develop your undersea fascination?
I grew up by the sea. I grew up in Brighton, which is a seaside resort. And I grew up, my father sailed, and so I got to sail some. And my school was right by the ocean. And from the school library, we could look out and see. We thought we could see to France. Actually, we couldn't, but we almost could. And we used to go in a crocodile 2x2 walking down from the school to the beach and swim at the beach. So I grew up with a huge amount of ocean and swimming. And then I moved, when I left there, I went to Spain, to the Mediterranean. So I had many, many oceans in my life. And people have sometimes asked me if that fascination came because my parents drowned, and that's how I lost my parents. They drowned in a cruise ship disaster when I was 19. But the fact is that I had that fascination long before that happened. I'm sure the fact that they found their deaths in the water, in the ocean, was something that fit right well with my fascination and my focus on the ocean. But that wasn't where it came from.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking about that. Do you have a poem that
I was
Do you
just
like to read?
something that would be short and let's see. Well, I could read about domestic terrorist.
Oh,
Domestic terrorist in inverted commas, because I don't mean it real. It's about horses. My other fascination. Domestic terrorist, and this is also inspired by Maxine Cumin, who wrote wonderful poems, and the front of this is from her, from one of hers. I trust the run from me, necks arched in a full swan's S, wild ones destined for dog food cans, crammed together, nipping and humping up half bucks, too tightly packed to let fly with unshod hoofs. Trust them to flee the corral on moonless nights when I slide back the poles and whisper to them and wait. The kneel out sideways, startled, find the fence of their compound breached. Then muffled snorts and messages on the breath huff through the tangled mass of horseflesh. Ears come forward, mud-caked heads lift high. Duns and greys, skewballs and bays, mares with tottering foals, a sway backbone, surge like a tide and funnel through the straight, bursting a couple of spans each side of the gap. I trust them to scent the fragrant pastures of home.
Oh, what a nice choice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I love that too.
Yes. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Really wonderful. Thank you. Let me.
Yeah, it's been great.
I appreciate it so much.
I want to say to everybody, take a look at Judith's website.
Yes, my website,
Do you want to say a word about that?
Just that it's judithbarrington.com, and that you can find a list of my books there. And you can order them from almost any good independent bookstore, and please do.
Yes, please do. I'm going to send that information out too with the broadside poem in a few days, and I'll include that information about where you could get Judith's books. Thank you.
May I just want to say one thing?
Yeah.
And it's to thank you and Joshua for making it possible for me to do this from home.
Yes.
I most appreciate that.
You're very welcome. And it's been wonderful doing this. And Josh is terrific because he set this up and made it happen. And I like seeing the things behind you too. So
that's Ruth's office.
Your office. Yes.
Office. This is her computer. It's a
yes. It looks like an office that's used.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you so much, Judith.
Thank you.
Kate Ray is going to be here in November, and I will say thank you all for being here and for being with us. Good night, and from us at the Milwaukie Poetry Series.
thank you.